You're listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We believe the Bible doesn't need to be watered down or cleaned up to be understood. Our goal is to provide a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. I'm your host, Colin Connor. Now, on to the episode. Welcome back, everyone, to our mini-series From Scroll to Screen, the Bible's Journey Through Time and Technology. We have a good bit to cover here today, so I am just going to hop right in and get started. I will say up front first, though, that if you didn't listen to last week's, I do recommend you go back because that was our Stuff You Don't Know episode. Lots of terms, a little nerdy, but I mean, come on, you are listening to a series about how we got our Bible, so I'm guessing you're a little nerdy too if you're listening to this in the first place. But yeah, last week's episode, we did a lot of overview about what is the Bible, how it was written, and all of that. This week, we are talking entirely about one topic, and that is canon. Now, when I say that word canon here in this discussion, I do not mean the kind that goes boom. That has two N's in the word. This, well, I guess technically three N's, C-A-N-N-O-N. This has one N in the middle, two in the word itself, C-A-N-O-N. Now, when we use that word canon to refer to the Bible, it comes from a Greek word, kanon, which literally means a rule or a measuring stick. So it's technically a good word for it would be ruler, like, you have in a school classroom, like a 1 foot ruler. Just like a ruler gives you a series of measurements to determine the length of something, so a canon, in the terms of the Bible, gives you the parameters to determine what is in and what is out. So when we're talking about canon, canonicity, all of that, it really boils down to what books ended up in the Bible, which didn't, and why. And as far as we can tell, it seems like a Dutch scholar named David Runken was probably the first to use this term canon to refer to texts in a religious corpus sometime in the 1700s. And I tend to think that if I did this episode like 10 years ago, not too many people would be familiar with the term canon. But lately, due to pop culture, and particularly superhero movies actually, the term canon is becoming a little more common. I believe it was in the second Spider-Verse movie where they had a whole plot point, really, about canon events, things that have to have happened in a certain character's life, usually Peter Parker, to become Spider-Man. And now that we have the MCU and the DCEU and all this, we have this term canon to refer to things that are officially a part of the timeline of a story. I think it really became popular with Star Wars when Disney bought out Star Wars, because when that happened, there were, dozens upon dozens, probably even hundreds of novels that had been written in the expanded universe of Star Wars. They weren't shown on film, they weren't necessarily official, but they were just out there, and it was more or less one big story. There was definitely some stuff that conflicted, but once Disney bought out Star Wars, everything that hadn't been on screen was no longer considered canon. Those were non-canonical events. And this is why I think talking about it in terms of nerdy movies and culture actually helps when we're talking about the Bible, because any Star Wars fan could tell you just because something didn't show up in an official live-action movie doesn't mean it's bad. Some of the novels in the expanded universe of Star Wars are some of the best Star Wars stories that you will ever read, better than some of the movies that have been made. There are some awesome comic books. There's storylines from video games like Force Unleashed that are really awesome, and just because they are not technically canon because they didn't show up in a live-action movie doesn't mean that they aren't worthwhile. That's the same thing with the Bible. I know the metaphor breaks down a little bit, but I think a lot of people have this idea that any books that didn't make it into the Bible are bad or maybe even dangerous, and that if you read them, you might fall away from your faith or become a heretic or something like that. But much like with Star Wars, just because something didn't make it into the Bible's canon doesn't automatically mean it's bad. There's some really great historical information, and yes, even spiritual information in some books that didn't make it into the Bible. Now, we're going to talk today about why they didn't make it in and how we should view them today. But I just want to say up front that something not being in the Bible is not a reason for you to be scared of it. We're going to get into a lot of nerdiness today about church fathers and which books they thought belonged in the Bible or not. And what we'll find with a lot of them is that even some books that they decided probably should not be in the Bible, they still considered to be useful for study. And like I mentioned last week, the Bible is really the only ancient document that a lot of people ever read, if they even read the Bible. And maybe if you're into philosophy, you're reading some stuff from like Plato and, some Greek thinkers around the same time. But the average person isn't going around and reading Greco-Roman or ancient Near Eastern literature. So these canonical books are actually a really good introduction to the world of the Bible, because many of them were floating around at the time of Jesus and the disciples and the early church. So if nothing else, they give you a little bit more of a window into the culture of the Bible and what sorts of things the biblical characters and authors would have been familiar with as popular works of their day. So I just want to give that to you up front here. Don't be afraid of these books. And in fact, I would encourage you, go out and try to read some of these. Many of them are available for free online. Now, not all of those translations are great, but you'll get the idea of what they're saying. And many of them you can buy in collected editions with other books that didn't make it into the Bible. For example, there's a book that I'm reading right now by Bar Ehrman called Lost Scriptures, books that did not make it into the New Testament. And there's something like 40-ish different translations of writings from around the time of Jesus and the early church that didn't make it into the Bible that are included in that work. So it's a really neat window into the world of Jesus beyond what we get just in the Bible. Now that we have defined what the word canon itself means, we should ask, well, what is the canon of the Bible? What books are in the Bible? Don't worry, I'm not going to list out all of them by name right here. That would be boring, something you can do just by checking the table of contents in your closest Bible. But it is important to ask that question because the answer might differ depending on what tradition you come from. I remember being a kid in Sunday school and singing this song that said, "The Bible has 66 books, of testaments there are 2, 39 books in the Old Testament, and 27 in the New." That was the entirety of the song. Yeah, it sounds great, and that makes it easy to remember how many are in each testament, but it's not entirely accurate depending on what tradition you came from. Now, if you are in the broad world of evangelicalism in America, or come from a Protestant tradition or an independent fundamental Baptist one like I did, that is going to accurately represent the Bible that you have on your desk or in your nightstand or wherever it is on your phone. But if you happen to be Catholic and listening to this, that number may sound a little low to you. Many Catholic Bibles include a section called the Apocrypha, and this is something we talked a little bit about last week. We introduced the concept. The word Apocrypha means hidden writings or secret writings, and a lot of people take that to mean there's secretive stuff in the writing, stuff that the average person wasn't supposed to know, and that is a possible way to explain the meaning. It's also possible to see it as these texts weren't made for public reading the same way that the books of the Bible in the Old and New Testaments that we have today are. These were more so for private study. So, secret in that sense of just like not made for reading in church, that sort of thing. So those sections with apocryphal writings or deuterocanonical writings, as we also called them last week, Old Testament Apocrypha, because there's also New Testament Apocrypha, which we will get into in this episode, they tend to have roughly around 7 to 13 additional writings from before the time of Jesus added in there. So the typical number for Catholics is going to be roughly 73 books in the Bible. And if you happen to come from an Eastern Orthodox tradition, you might even have a couple extras added on beyond that. And we'll talk about some of the differences in canon as we go through this episode. So what do we do with this understanding that not every Bible we have is exactly the same in the books that it includes? Well, if you came from a tradition like I did in the Independent Fundamental Baptist Church, you just assume that we have the one right way and everyone else is wrong. And, that's nice and comforting to believe. But I think especially when you realize that Catholics make up roughly half of all Christians in the world today. All right, so of all the people who claim to be Christian across the world today, roughly half of them are Catholics. That means that if you have just 66 books in your Bible, you are actually in the minority of Christians in the world today. And then when you consider the history of Catholicism too, and how far back it stretches, now I realize many Catholics want to trace it all the way back to Peter as being the first pope and the start of the Catholic Church. I would differ with them on that. I do not consider myself to be a Catholic, but we can at least agree that within a couple hundred years of Jesus, the Catholic Church was established in a form that it has pretty much carried through to today. And it had a big hand in establishing the canon of the church at large. Now, Baptists, on the other hand, just going with the tradition I came from, are really only about 400 years old as a denomination. Now, in the circles I came from, we wanted to try to claim that we could trace it all the way back to Jesus and the apostles, and there was all kinds of fun stuff that we pulled to try to make that work. I would say about equal to some Catholics trying to trace their faith all the way back to Peter. All right, when you're trying to make an unbroken lineage, it gets messy, and you know what? That's something that we should do a podcast on at some point, is this idea of an unbroken heritage of the church and trying to trace our faith lineage all the way back. Because a surprising number of churches think that they can do that, and it doesn't work great. So while there have certainly been people who protested against the main overarching state or empire at that time, Church of Rome, they weren't Protestants in the sense of like Martin Luther in the 1500s. Likewise, just because some people had some doctrine that was ishly similar to modern-day Baptist doctrine doesn't mean that, Baptists existed 1600 years ago. So the Baptist faith as we know it today is roughly only 400-ish years old. Evangelicalism as a whole is only at max 250 years old. I think you could even bring it into the last 100-ish years. And the fundamentalist circles that I came from are really only about 100 years old as well, from like the turn of the 20th century, 1900s. So when you stop and think for a moment that the majority of the Christians in the world today have roughly 73 books in their Bible, and the majority of Christians throughout church history have also had more than 66 books, because the Catholic Church traces its lineage back a lot further than Protestant churches do. And if we even go off of the Eastern Orthodox Church that has a couple more than the Catholic Church, that's basically as old as the Catholic Church. I mean, the difference between Catholic and Eastern Orthodox basically just comes down to which side of the Roman Empire did it land on. The Western side, which was a good bit of Italy and Africa, it kind of made this like sea curve, and everything on the left of the sea was Catholic, everything on the right of the sea was Eastern Orthodox, and so anything getting into Eastern Europe and even Turkey and a lot of the Middle East area ended up being Eastern Orthodox. So there's a whole lot of stuff that we don't have time to get into today that had bad blood between the Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church, but in many ways they are similar, and they trace back to basically the same origin point where they split off from each other. So we're talking about the majority of Christians throughout church history, and the ones who are closest to the time of Jesus have had more books in their Bible than what we as Protestants, evangelicals, independent Baptists, whatever you might come from, what we have. That should give you pause to at least question, why do I think I'm right more than the majority of Christians throughout the last 2,000 years have been? And we'll get into all that in the next several minutes here, but I just want to make you uncomfortable with that thought up front. If you are settled on this idea of just the 39 books of the Old Testament, the 27 in the New, and we don't ever touch anything else, well, you're in the minority in church history. So that should at very least, even if it doesn't change your mind, it should get you to stop and think, why do I take that position when the majority of Christians in the last 2,000 years have not? All right, sufficiently uncomfortable yet? Good. We're going to take a quick break here, and we will come back and start talking about how the canon was determined. Who got to decide what ended up in the Bible and why? When it comes to who determined what's in the Bible and why, I tend to see two different extremes that people go to, with not a lot in the middle, unfortunately. If you go online and you happen across, say, maybe an atheist talking about the Bible, or even some progressive Christians, they often emphasize how arbitrary the practice of canonicity was, who got to decide what's in the Bible and why. They focus very much on the power dynamics of just powerful people in church history getting to say, these are the books that I like, these are the ones that I want in. And especially post Da Vinci Code with Dan Brown, a lot of people have come to think that the Council of Nicaea in 325 determined which books belong in the Bible. And really, the Emperor Constantine got to decide these are the books that are going to be in the Christian New Testament, especially. That's just simply not true. It makes for good fiction writing, but it's not historical fact. On the far other side of the spectrum is where I came from, where you have so much emphasis on God's hand in the canonization process that you almost ignore any human aspect to this. So they're going to the far other extreme. The pendulum has swung to the other side now, where it is all about, well, God is the one who determined what the canon was going to be, and he made sure that the people who were making these decisions knew which books to put in. This was all his making clear to them through the Holy Spirit which books need to be in the Bible. And you know what? If you want to believe that, that's fine. But you can't state that as historical fact because you can't prove that. And there's also nothing in the Bible, there's no verse you can turn to that would say, hey, in the 300-ish years after Jesus, I am going to make sure that only the books that I want in the Bible are going to get in there signed Jesus. Like, that's not in the Bible. There is no promise that all the right books are going to be there. We assume that, and it's okay if you want to believe that the Holy Spirit had a hand in guiding early church leaders to pick certain books over others, but there's no way of proving that. I could tell you that God led me to move to California, and there is no way you can fight that assertion, because you don't know whether he did or not, and if I'm being honest, I don't know either. I can believe that. I can have this feeling in my heart, this intense inclination to make this decision, but I don't actually know how much of that is God. I don't know how much of that is my culturally conditioned conscience. I don't know how much of that is my own subconscious desires. I don't know how much of that is my own internal monologue that I am attributing to God, right? There is so much of this that is subjective. So you can't make a historical fact claim that God guided the process of which books were going to be added in for sure or not. He very well could have. But there is no way of knowing for sure if God was guiding the people who made the decisions, or if God was maybe trying to guide the people who were in opposition to this and who just got beat out by those who had a little bit more power and louder voice in the conversation. We need to be careful not to go too far into either extreme of making canonization all about God or all about humans. It's not like the Bible dropped down from heaven in a leather-bound King James edition with 66 books in it. And it's also not like a bunch of mobsters in a dark room deciding which books they want in and not, and no one was in the room where it happened. As a Christian, I do like to believe that God had a hand in emphasizing certain works over others. But if we are going to take that position, we also then have to wrestle with how the people who made those decisions often included more than the 66 books in our Protestant Bibles today. So we don't get to pick and choose and say, God guided their process in these 66 books. Oh, but they got it wrong in the others. See, something that we're going to get into that not a lot of people realize is that when most of these canon lists were established, and there were several different ones we'll be talking about in the next several minutes, a lot of them included the Apocrypha and some works that even aren't included in the Apocrypha of the Catholic Bible. See, canonization was a messy process, and it left a lot of unsatisfied parties. In many ways, the decisions that were made in the first few hundred years of the church continue to get pushed back on even today. I might even argue especially today, in the last 100 years, as we have had more archaeological discoveries of ancient texts from that time. We have gotten some of the first copies of some of these works that didn't make it into the Bible, or some of the oldest copies of these works that didn't make it into the Bible, where before the copies we had were from medieval times. So the more that people are starting to realize, thanks to the internet and archaeological discoveries, that these works exist, they're starting to ask the question more and more, well, why weren't they included in the Bible? And people can come to faulty conclusions about what the criteria were for certain books ending up in the Bible and for others not to. I've heard some people say, well, it's just about what everyone agreed on. There were some people who wanted a few other books in, there were some that wanted a few less, maybe, but this is what everyone got together and agreed upon. Well, not necessarily, because again, we are going to talk about quite a few different canon lists, and not everyone agrees on the 66 books that we ended up with today. Even some of the books that ended up in the Bible were disputed whether or not they should be there. Not just the stuff that didn't make it in, even some of the stuff that did was disputed. I also remember hearing growing up that whichever books in the Old Testament were quoted in the New Testament determined whether or not those books belonged in. So, like, if a book was quoted in the New Testament, it belonged in the canon. Well, that doesn't work because the New Testament doesn't necessarily quote every single book that's in the Old Testament. Now, there's some disagreement here because sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between a quote, an allusion, a reference. Like, we don't necessarily know, okay, this sounds a little bit like that passage, so was the author referencing that? I mean, he doesn't quote it exactly, so do we count that? But there's debate about whether the books of Judges, Ruth, Esther, Ezra, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, Lamentations, Obadiah, or Zephaniah are quoted or referenced at all in the New Testament. And furthermore, there are several books quoted in both the Old and New Testaments that aren't biblical books. I mean, just going off of the Old Testament, you have the book of Jasher mentioned in Joshua and 2 Samuel. That's nowhere in the Bible. You have the book of the Wars of the Lord mentioned in Numbers, the book of Shemaiah the prophet, the story of the prophet of Iddo in 2 Chronicles, the Acts of Solomon mentioned in 1 Kings, the Annals of King David in 1 Chronicles, the book of Samuel the seer in 1 and 2 Samuel and 1 Chronicles, the book of Nathan the prophet in 1 and 2 Chronicles, the book of Gad the seer in 1 Chronicles, the prophecy of Ahijah in 2 Chronicles, the book of Jehu in 2 Chronicles, the story of the book of the Kings in 2 Chronicles, the Acts of Uzziah in 2 Chronicles, the vision of Isaiah in 2 Chronicles, the Acts of the Kings of Israel in 2 Chronicles, sayings of the seers also in 2 Chronicles, the Lamentations for Josiah in 2 Chronicles, and the Chronicles of King Ahasuerus in Esther and Nehemiah. And we could probably even go on with a few others. Now, you may have noticed most of those are in Chronicles with some in Samuel and Kings, so there's a lot of reference within the Old Testament to books that aren't in the Old Testament. So it's not just a matter of, oh, if it's quoted in the Bible, it's Bible. Same thing happens in the New Testament. Jude, Peter, and John all reference the book of Enoch, which is not in the Bible. 2 Timothy mentions the Apocrypha of Jannes and Jambres without even stopping to say, oh yeah, this is another work from that time. We don't count it as Bible, but, I'm just going to quote it here. No, the author of 2 Timothy just mentions part of that book as fact, as part of the argument that he's making, right alongside references to books that are in the Bible. Colossians mentions an epistle to the Laodiceans, which may have been Ephesians, but we don't know that for sure. 2 Corinthians mentions the life of Adam and Eve, which was a book from back then. Jude mentions the ascension of Moses. Hebrews, the ascension of Isaiah. The letter to Corinthians that we call 1 Corinthians actually references a letter that Paul wrote before that to the Corinthian church. So our 1 Corinthians is, at very least, the second letter that he wrote to Corinth. And then 2 Corinthians mentions a letter in between those two that doesn't match 1 Corinthians. So Paul wrote at least 4 letters to Corinth, but we only have 1st and 2nd, which are actually 2nd and 4th if you're counting the other two. Ephesians mentions a letter where Paul wrote to them previously. And then there's also possibly several other references to works that we just don't have, where it seems clear that the author is alluding to something, but as far as we know, we have not discovered what that text would have been, so we don't know how to attribute that. So none of those theories work for determining whether or not a book should be in the Bible. And the process of canonization was a little bit different for the Old Testament versus the New Testament. They were not written in exactly the same way. We talked about that a little bit last week with the differences in scribal practices between the Old and New Testaments. The Hebrew Bible wasn't really something that was made in multiple copies to the same degree that the New Testament was. There were several different copies of it, but the New Testament letters and the Gospels were copied much more frequently, much more quickly in the process, because they were being spread around from church to church and being carried all over the world, whereas the Hebrew scriptures were just kept in one location, with Israel being, roughly the size of New Jersey. Not to mention that there was really only one central point of religious worship in Jerusalem. Granted, there were others that cropped up that were less orthodox, and then by the time of Jesus, we have synagogues that had different scrolls as well. But the Hebrew text was much more, I guess you could say, ceremonial. It was much more official in the way that it was copied. It was done by professional scribes. Whereas with the New Testament, like we talked about last week, some of the copying may have even been done by slaves that people owned, just trying to get these works out to other churches. So next week we're going to get into translation issues, and we'll find that the Old Testament has fewer than the New Testament because of the way that each was copied down. However, when it comes to the issue of canonization, I would say it's about equal where the questions arise, because the apocryphal works, the deuterocanonical works, fall during what Christians would call Old Testament time period, or most of them were written in the Second Temple time period in between the Old and New Testaments. And there's definitely some debate about New Testament works as well, so I guess it's about even between the two, which one has more debate of books being in or not. The Hebrew Bible, according to the Jewish understanding, is going to have 24 books. We talked about this last week. That is not actually fewer than the 39 in our Christian Old Testaments. It's just that certain books got combined, like 1st and 2nd Chronicles is actually just Chronicles. Ezra and Nehemiah are combined into one book, that sort of thing. So that gets you down to the number 24. And it's the 5 books of the Torah, which means instruction, the 8 prophetical works in the Nevi'im, Nevi'im means prophets, and that includes one collection called the 12, which is what we call the minor prophets, and then the 11 ketuvim, or writings. As far as we can tell, the process of canonizing the Hebrew Bible happened roughly between 400 BCE and 100 CE. The Torah, the 5 books of Moses, the Pentateuch, whatever you want to call them, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, form the core of the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh. And it seems like that was the first group of books to be established as, I mean, they wouldn't have used the word canonical back then, but, just using our modern terminology, this is what they determined was super important for their faith and practice. And that probably would have happened around 400 BCE. So this is after the Babylonian exile. This is after the Jews have returned back into the land. This is just slightly after the time of Ezra and Nehemiah rebuilding Jerusalem. And like I mentioned last week, this is not to say that that is when those stories were first written. It is quite likely that the stories began being written down quite a bit before that, and then even longer before that started as oral narratives. See, the Hebrew Bible began as these oral stories that people would tell, and there were different versions, just like with any story that we tell orally. And then over time, as they began to write these stories down, you would get a slightly different version from the tradition that had heard it told this way, and from as compared to the tradition that had heard it told that way. And what happened is, over time, these different versions got collected together, and you might have had someone that only had the scroll of Genesis, and then you have someone over here who had a different version of part of the scroll of Genesis, and then someone over here who had the whole 5 books of Moses, and then someone over here that had those plus a few others in the prophets or in the writings, and so it all starts to get compiled together into one. And then eventually it is edited into basically the final form that we know it today. So the Torah would have been the first 5 books to have that happen. And then likely the prophets within a couple hundred years of that, and the writings anywhere from around that time to possibly even into around 100 CE, depending on who you listen to. There's a lot of disagreement over when exactly this was established, because there is no singular Old Testament text from that time that we can turn to. We have a lot of different collections, we have a lot of different fragments, but we have to remember that these books were not written down in an internet age where we can all compare notes as soon as something is written down. An author can write a book, and granted, the process of writing a book today still takes quite a bit of time, but within a few months to a year or two from the time he's done writing the book, you end up with a copy that anyone around the world can read today. That's not how it worked back then. Someone wrote something, and then it had to be copied down by hand. There were no printing presses. There was, none of that for a couple thousand more years. So some Jewish groups had more religious texts than others at that time. And if you have a book on canonization from, 100 years ago or more, you'll probably find in it a reference to something called the Council of Jamnia. This was a pretty popular theory for a while, that there was a council that had met up in this area called Jamnia, or sometimes Jabna, where a group of Jewish leaders got together and established the canon of the Hebrew Bible, and specifically said it is going to be these 24 books only. And a lot of people would say that was a reaction to the growing number of Jewish works being written about this guy named Jesus. Because remember, at that time, Christianity was still just a Jewish sect. So this is only like 60-ish years after Jesus. A lot of people would say it was sometime between 70 and 90, and it was done as a response to this growing corpus of Christian literature. The problem is, we don't really have documentation of that happening. The theory that this council existed really only goes back to about 1871 with one German scholar named Heinrich Graetz, and it seems like he may have misinterpreted a rabbinic work that led him to conclude that there was this Council of Jamnia that happened sometime between 70 and 90 CE that determined the Jewish canon as a response to Christianity. We're not even 100% sure that such a council happened, and even if it did, we don't know what it talked about. So for the last 20-ish years of modern scholarship, the general consensus has been that there was no determination of a Jewish canon at the Council of Jamnia. That's just Christians thinking that they are the center of the world and everything that happens has to be about them. It is becoming more widely accepted, though, that the Jewish canon was possibly determined by the Hasmoneans between 140 and 37 BCE. Now, for context, the Hasmoneans were a Jewish family that ruled Judea semi-autonomously in between the Greek and Roman rule of that area. This would have been after Judas Maccabeus, of fame from the books of the Maccabees, which we'll talk about in a little bit here, after he had defeated the Seleucid army. So I realize some of you are going, yawn, you lost me, I have no clue what you're talking about. I get it. It's a lot of names, and it's not stuff you normally hear in church. That being said, the Hasmoneans and Judas Maccabeus and all that is actually very important for understanding the world that Jesus lived in. So within the next year here, sometime in 2025, I'm going to do an episode that just gives a big picture of the storyline of the Bible and focuses a good bit on that time in between what we call the Old and New Testaments, the Second Temple period. And we'll get more into why the Hasmoneans were important then. But, just throwing this out now to whet your appetite for anyone that's actually interested in that sort of thing. So whether the Hasmoneans had a direct hand in establishing the canon of the Hebrew Bible or not, their rule definitely helped to facilitate the general acceptance of those 24 Hebrew texts in the 100 years before and after Jesus. We've established now how the 24 Hebrew books that make up our 39 in the Old Testament came to be collected together. But they weren't the only books that were up for consideration for the canon of the Hebrew Bible. There were, in particular, 7 other books floating around in that time that are Tobit, Judith, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, Wisdom, which is sometimes also called the Wisdom of Solomon, or Ecclesiasticus, not Ecclesiastes, but Ecclesiasticus, Sirach, which is also sometimes called the Wisdom of Sirach, Ben Sirach, the Wisdom of Jesus, son of Sirach, any of those titles. That is not the Jesus of the New Testament, different Jesus, and Baruch. And sometimes Baruch has a 6th chapter added onto it called the Letter of Jeremiah. There are also a couple extra chapters that occasionally get added onto the books of Daniel and Esther. So some versions circling around at that time had 3 additional chapters in Daniel and 6 additional chapters in Esther. So depending on what area you came from or what tradition you came from in Israel at Jesus' time, your book of Daniel, your scroll of Daniel at your local synagogue, may have had 3 more chapters than what we are used to in our English Bibles today. Likewise, if you had a scroll of Esther there, it might have had even 6 additional chapters than what we are used to. And if you have a copy of a Catholic Bible, you will find, more than likely, all of those works added in under the section titled Apocrypha. Now, there were some other works as well, and these are the ones that end up in the Eastern Orthodox canon. This would be 3rd and 4th Maccabees, because the other one was just 1st and 2nd, so this now adds 3rd and 4th. A 151st Psalm, so an additional psalm. The Prayer of Manasseh, which is often tacked onto the end of Chronicles, and the book of 1st Esdras. So while those works were not ultimately added into the Hebrew canon, or the Protestant canon, or even the Catholic canon, they are in the Eastern Orthodox canon, which is roughly from the same time period as the Catholic canon. And then you even get some differences in certain Coptic churches, certain Ethiopian churches. Armenia's national church and the Ethiopian Orthodox Church add 2nd Esdras in there. There are some Ethiopian Orthodox churches that add Jubilees. Some even add a little bit extra to Jeremiah. There's also the Peshitta, which honestly I should probably save mentioning this for later, since it also includes the New Testament, and we're just talking about Hebrew Bible texts at this point and Second Temple literature texts. But you know what? I'll just mention it here since I already brought it up. The Peshitta is a Syriac translation of the Bible dating to roughly the 2nd to 5th century CE. It's quite possible the translation of the Hebrew texts was done before the translation of the Greek New Testament texts. But that particular translation tends to include all of the apocryphal books that we have mentioned, so like the ones in the Catholic canon, the one in the Eastern, the couple extra from the Eastern Orthodox canon, even a couple of the additional ones that floated around. Plus, it adds 4 more Psalms, Psalms 152 to 155, and when it comes to the New Testament, it excludes 2 Peter, 2nd and 3rd John, Jude, and Revelation in some of the earlier forms, but then later translations into Syriac have added those back in. Now, there's one other canon tradition for the Hebrew Bible text that we have to talk about before we move any further, and that is the Samaritan tradition. The Samaritans are an ethno-religious group that originated when Assyria conquered the northern 12 tribes in Israel. So if you're reading through the Old Testament, you have 2 captivities mentioned in Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. And the first was with the northern 10 tribes going into captivity in Assyria. And then the main one that everyone talks about is the second one when Babylon conquered the southern 2 tribes. But when Assyria rolls in the first place and conquers the northern 10, it leaves some people in the land. And that region had come to be known as Samaria. So the people that were left in the land were Samaritans. Yes, the same Samaritans that we get in the New Testament stories of Jesus and the woman at the well, as well as the famous parable of the Good Samaritan. And I might add, they still exist as a people group today. We tend to focus just on the Jews as a people group today from Bible times because modern Israeli culture is so tied politically to what's going on in America and vice versa. But there's also Samaritans that still exist today from the time of the Bible. And their translation of the Holy Scriptures is different from the Jewish one because they only accept the Torah, just the 5 books of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, as authoritative. Not the prophets, not the writings. And in addition, they use a different version of the Torah that has been translated into a Samaritan dialect that is basically a sister language to Hebrew. And it has a handful of differences compared to the Hebrew text from which we have translated into our English Bibles. Now, a lot of it's minor differences, but there's some significant ones as well. I bring this up to remind you that the canon was not decided by the least common denominator of which books everyone agrees on. Because if that was the case, we would only have the 5 books of Moses, because that is a least common denominator where these Samaritan groups do not even include any of the other books of the Old Testament, much less the New Testament. And adding to the craziness of all of this, there is even a particular Samaritan group in the area of Nablus, which is probably near Shechem, using Bible terminology, that claims to have the oldest existing copy of the Torah, of the 5 books of Moses. And they claim it was actually penned by Abishai, the grandson of Aaron. Now, if you're going off of the common idea that whatever is oldest, whatever is getting closest to the originals is probably the most accurate, well, then that is older than any edition of the Hebrew Torah that we have. Granted, this is severely complicated by the fact that access to that Torah is extremely limited, and no one is really able to actually go and validate these claims that they have a copy of the Torah that goes back so far. But you can likely imagine how if you grew up in those communities there and were constantly told that you have this copy of the Torah that goes all the way back to just a couple generations after Moses, well, that could make you think that you have the right way, whereas everyone else got it wrong. I mean, talk about fundamentalism, right? You are stripping it down to the very basics of just those 5 books of Moses. All right, how are we feeling right now? Have I muddied the waters enough? Well, we are not done with this discussion yet, so let's just take a second, pause, stretch, take a quick breather, and then we'll come back and talk a little bit more about what books Jesus and the early church would have had in their Bibles. About 60 years after Jesus, Josephus famously stated that the Jews have only 22 books believed to be divine: the 5 books of the Torah, the 13 prophets, and what he called 4 hymns. Now, some of you more astute listeners, if your brains have not been completely fried by everything I've said so far today, may be thinking for a second, wait, didn't you say there were 24 books in the Hebrew Bible, and Josephus is saying 22? Yes, that is correct. There is debate over exactly which books he included and which he left out, particularly since his collection of 5 books of the Torah, 13 prophets, and 4 quote-unquote hymns doesn't quite match exactly with the standard Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, right, designations that we have spoken of before. And it's possible that he was still including the exact same text, just under different names. Maybe he combined a couple extra as well to get to 22 instead of 24, but we don't really know for sure. So that's from just shortly after the time of Jesus. Like, people could have been alive in the time of Jesus and still alive in the time of Josephus. And he's talking about 22 books that roughly correspond to what was established as the Hebrew canon and what we have translated into English in our Old Testaments today. There's also a book called Second Esdras, which tradition says was written by Ezra roughly 500-ish years before Jesus, but it could have actually been written more likely around the time of Jesus, or maybe even a couple hundred years later, depending on who you listen to. That mentions the 24 books that we are familiar with. Jesus, the disciples, and the early church, though, seem to have used the Septuagint mostly. This, we talked about a bit last week. The Septuagint is a series of translations of the ancient Hebrew texts into the modern common Greek vernacular of that day. And just like there were variations in traditions of the Hebrew text, and some of the stories were slightly different, some of the versions were slightly different, same thing with the Septuagint. There was not necessarily one leather-bound copy of the Septuagint that you could buy from the store like you can today with a Bible. There were varying traditions of these Greek texts as well. But I believe, and several scholars would agree, that it seems most likely Jesus, the 12 disciples, and the early church used these Greek translations in the Septuagint of the Hebrew texts more than the Hebrew texts themselves. You say, why would they do that? Well, after the Jews came back into the land from the Babylonian exile, Greek was becoming the lingua franca, the main language of the world, and they wanted to include their sacred scriptures in this language to preserve it. Not to mention, there was an entire generation or two born in exile that may not have learned Hebrew as much as they learned Greek at that time. So this was likely the prevailing editions of any of the Hebrew texts in Jesus' day. And we can tell this because if you've ever looked at a passage in the New Testament where a character or one of the authors quotes an Old Testament passage, and then you go back and you look either in Hebrew or even sometimes in your English translation of the Old Testament, you might find that it doesn't really match. It's close enough, you get the main idea, but there's some differences in wording between the way the New Testament authors put it and the way the Old Testament authors did. Now, if you were able to take the way it was written in the New Testament Greek, like if you could just look at the Greek of it, and then go back to the Septuagint, it almost always matches significantly closer than comparing it to the Hebrew version. So that indicates to us is more than likely that Jesus and the early church would have been using the Septuagint for their Hebrew texts. They would have been reading them in Greek. And you say, okay, well, what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is that means that the quote-unquote Bible, the sacred Jewish scriptures of the early church and of Jesus and of the disciples likely included everything we have in our Old Testaments, plus the additional works that are in the Septuagint. First Esdras, Judith, Tobit, First through Fourth Maccabees. the 151st Psalm, the Prayer of Manasseh, the Wisdom of Solomon, the Wisdom of Sirach, Baruch, the Letter of Jeremiah, the Psalms of Solomon, possibly even a hymnal called Odai, or sometimes Odes in English. They would have likely counted more books as sacred scripture in their quote unquote Old Testaments. That was just the Bible of the day. That was their sacred scriptures. The New Testament was being written or lived out at that time, so that wasn't written yet. They would have had more in those texts than we do in our Old Testaments. And if you were to grab like a Catholic Bible today, you would likely see three different divisions. You would have the Old Testament, the Apocrypha, and the New Testament. Or some editions might move the Apocrypha to the very end. But since those writings were usually in between the writings of the Old and New Testament, they tend to squish them in between the two. But remember, there was no big one leather-bound edition of the Septuagint. These were still scrolls back then. They weren't put into codices, into books like we have them today. So they were just collections of scrolls. And so these apocryphal works, as we would label them, were mixed in with the other scrolls. And we even see this in translations and canons moving up into the time of the Protestant Reformation, the 1500s CE. A lot of times these apocryphal works were sprinkled throughout the other texts. It wasn't really until around the time of Martin Luther that they got moved into their own section apart from everything else. They would have just been there alongside the other books of the Bible. Like if you get into some of the later collected editions of the Septuagint where it is in like a codex form, you have the 5 books of Moses, and you have some of the history books like Joshua, Judges, Ruth, Kings, Chronicles. Then you get 1st Esdras, then Ezra and Nehemiah, then Esther, then Judith, Tobit, through 3rd Maccabees, then Psalms. And different versions of it put them in slightly different orders, but you get the idea. It's right there alongside the other books. It's not like they are set apart as something other than the rest of the books that we have accepted as the Bible. Now, as Christianity became a more prominent sect in Judaism and eventually even outnumbered Judaism, the Septuagint started to fall out of favor in Jewish communities as rabbis started to scrutinize the text a little bit more and realize that there are several passages where the Greek translation isn't necessarily the best to represent what's in the underlying Hebrew. It still gets the main point across, but there's enough that caused issues and even led to some Christian interpretations we find in the New Testament that a lot of Jewish leaders started to pull away from using that text in favor of going back to the Hebrew text itself. And then that was around the time that the Masoretes got together and started to create the Masoretic text tradition, which we'll get into a little bit more next week. So hopefully you can see by this point kind of two sides of the same coin. On the one hand, there's enough general agreement amongst the majority of Jewish people at that time about what books are important for their sacred scriptures. But on the other hand, hopefully you're able to see that there's also enough difference and debate that it's not as clean cut as a lot of people would like to think it was. And we're going to get into even more of that as we talk now about the Christian canon. As we talk about the Christian canon moving forward here, I am going to assume the establishment of the 24 books of the Hebrew canon already. Because as I've already stated, but I think is good for us to remember, early Christians were mostly still Jews. It was just a sect of Judaism, and even as Gentiles, non-Jews started to come into this faith, they were more so seen as proselytes to this sect of Judaism. I mean, that's a lot of what Paul wrote about, was now that Christianity is becoming more diverse, how much is it staying Judaism and how much is it becoming its own thing? So we're just going to assume that they already accepted the text that we have talked about as useful and authoritative because they would have been considered a part of their Jewish scriptures. So just moving into the works of the New Testament time period, the New Testament was written roughly between 500 and 120 CE. Now, you will get different numbers there depending on who you talk to. More conservative scholars will tend to keep the numbers closer to the time of Jesus. A lot of times they tend to think that the books of the New Testament were written in roughly the order that we have them in the New Testament, with Revelation being the last. A lot of people will say roughly around 90 CE. Some will even move it back as early as the late 60s CE. And then some more liberal scholars might add in a little bit more time there, with some of the books being finalized in the mid to late 100 CE. You'll even get some people who will start pushing around 200, but that's usually not widely accepted. If you were to open up a New Testament today, you are first greeted by the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so I think a lot of people assume those were written first. But in reality, it is quite likely that Paul's letters were first written. I mean, just think about the timeline with me. If we go into Acts, Paul became a prominent figure in the early church within 3 to 10 years after Jesus. I mean, certainly within 15 years after Jesus. So he has been writing all of these different letters to all of these different churches, and as far as we can tell, he wrote quite a bit, and quite a bit that we don't have. I mean, it seems quite likely that he wrote dozens upon dozens, probably even hundreds of letters in his lifetime, and we only have roughly a dozen-ish in our New Testaments, though who exactly authored some of them is still a matter of debate. So it's quite likely that he began writing within 20 years of Jesus' lifetime, and then some of the Gospels probably came in shortly after that, overlapping with some of the same time that Paul was writing, but possibly even going a little later. Most scholars would agree that Mark was probably the first gospel to be written. There's some debate for sure. I mean, come on, if you've listened to more than one episode of this podcast, you know that everything is subject to debate when it comes to the Bible. But most would say Mark was probably the first, then usually Matthew, then Luke. There's, of course, debate over that. And then most would agree that John was the last gospel to be written. And then some of the general epistles like James, Hebrews, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, Jude, Revelation, all of those tend to be considered later writings, often pushing around 100 CE. And much like how we talked about the Old Testament texts developing over time, having an initial oral form and then having different oral traditions, then having different written traditions, and then eventually being edited together into the form we know today. Same thing might have been true with some of these books, that it seems like there were different versions of each of these New Testament books that we have, the Gospels, the epistles. There's variations as they got copied. It's entirely possible that Paul might have written one version of Ephesians, and then as he was getting ready to have it copied and sent out to other churches, may have said, you know what, I wanted to change this a little bit in here, so let's reword it to be this. And then you end up with a totally different textual tradition for those books. So when they started being written and when they ended up in the exact final edited version that we have today may have been slightly different time periods. But can you see how much more compact the period of writing the New Testament was? By roughly 100 years after Jesus, we have all of the books of our New Testament written, and, much like with the Old Testament, several other books as well that are debated whether or not they should be included. Within 100 years of Jesus, we already have Christians fighting over which books should be read in Christian gatherings and which should be left out of these public gatherings. Because remember, just because something isn't included in the canon of Scripture doesn't mean that it wasn't considered to be authoritative or useful or possibly even inspired writing, if we go back to last week's conversation about what it means for something to be God-breathed and for something to be scripture. Because remember, that's just the word graphe. It just means writing. And we don't get to necessarily pick and choose when we think the word should be writing and when it should be scripture, because it can have both meanings, but it tends to be very arbitrary when we use one definition over the other. So Christians were already fighting about that within 100 years after Jesus. And right around 100 years after Jesus, we have this guy named Justin Martyr. Now, Martyr was not actually his last name. It was a title that was given to him after he was, go figure, martyred. He wrote that in worship services, Christians read, quote, the memoirs of the apostles. So most scholars take that to mean the Gospels. But all he says is memoirs of the apostles. That's plural memoirs of the apostles. That could just be two. He doesn't say which one. So for all we know, he could have just been referring to Matthew and Mark, or John and Matthew, or Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but not John. Or maybe he was including the Gospel of Peter in there. We don't know. All we know is he's referring to these, quote, memoirs of the apostles. Now, the first guy that we know of, and that's a key point I should have made earlier, that we know of. All of this that we've talked about is just based on records that we have from these time periods. It is entirely likely that other people were having these discussions and trying to formulate canon lists and all this, and we just don't have record of them. So all we can go off of is what we know. And one of the earliest people that we know to purposefully try to collect together what Christian texts he thought were authoritative for gatherings together was a guy named Marcion. But Marcion ended up on the wrong side of history, and even today is still one of the early church's most famous heretics. He was declared a heretic by some very powerful Christian leaders of his day who didn't like how he separated the teachings of the Hebrew Bible from the teachings of the early church. Marcion really wrestled with how God often appeared violent in the Old Testament, whereas Jesus often appeared more loving and compassionate in the New Testament. I mean, if we're being honest, that's a struggle that many people still have today. And while many Christians try to reconcile those two issues in their mind, or sometimes ignore them altogether, or just chalk it up to, well, God's ways are different than ours, Marcion went a little bit more extreme. He thought that Jesus was the supreme representative of what God's love was supposed to be. And he decided that the way God was represented in the previous 24 Hebrew scriptures that had been established was actually an entirely different God than the God of Jesus. And so he did not consider the Hebrew texts authoritative. So it's quite possible that Marcion may have been one of the first Christians to separate the idea of two testaments. Because remember, up until this point, most of the church is still Jewish. And so from their perspective, they have the 24 established sacred writings, and then several others from the Septuagint that are also important and sometimes even read in community. And now we're adding on some more that are part of this Christian sect, but they would have probably just been put on par with the Apocrypha as some extra writings added on to the 24 established ones. They weren't seen as their own testament, as we would call it today. And it seems possible that Marcion may have been the first one to start pushing for a separation of an Old Testament and a New Testament to say, you know what, I'm going to get rid of all of those Old Testament works, which most Christians would not go that far, but a lot of pastors basically treat the Old Testament that way. They only reference it when they think it refers back to Jesus, but otherwise they spend all their time in Paul. They almost commit the same heresy that Marcion did, just in a roundabout way. Well, he even narrowed down the New Testament canon to mostly focus around the Gospel of Luke, although it was a pretty different version than what we're familiar with today. It did not have the birth narrative. It did not have Jesus' baptism. It was a shortened version. It seems like he edited it to match his idea of what the teachings of that gospel should be. And then he also included only 10 of Paul's epistles, and in this particular order: Galatians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Romans, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, Laodiceans, which may have been its own work or may possibly have been Ephesians. We're not 100% sure on that. Colossians, Philemon, and Philippians. But the majority of the early church did not seem to like the way that Marcion handled these particular doctrinal issues and the Hebrew scriptures and the Gospels, so he was relegated to the heresy bin of church history and his canon along with it. Very shortly after him, though, just a couple decades, we have a record of something called the Muratorian canon. And we have it in fragmentary form. It is, in the form that we have it today, 85 lines of a Latin manuscript, probably from around the late 100s CE, though, of course, there's debate with some placing it even a couple hundred years later than that. It seems to have likely included an Old Testament canon, but that part of it is lost, so we don't know for sure if it would have agreed completely with the 24 books of the Hebrew Bible. It likely did. It starts with the 4 Gospels, but only Luke and John are readable, so we're not 100% sure what the first 2 Gospels this Muratorian canon included. Scholars believe it was Matthew and Mark most likely, but there's no way to know for sure. It then continues to match our New Testament canon until we pass Philemon, where it leaves out Hebrews, James, 1st and 2nd Peter, and questions the validity of 1st through 3rd John. It does include Revelation, but then it also adds the Apocalypse of Peter and the Wisdom of Solomon to the canon after Revelation, and recommends that the Shepherd of Hermas should be read, though not necessarily included in the canon. So just to recap here real quick, in the first roughly 150 years of church history after Jesus, we have just a couple records of people trying to group together New Testament texts into a canon, and they don't entirely match what we have today. Now, particularly the Muratorian fragment is similar, but it doesn't match identically. So we can see there is still debate over which text should be included in the New Testament or not, up to 150 years after Jesus. And as we're going to see, it goes even beyond that, but just for how far we've gotten. Around the same time as the Muratorian canon, there was a bishop named Irenaeus, and he came up with this threefold strategy for deciding which books should be considered canon or not. Now, it is quite possible other people used similar parameters before that, but he is the first one that we have record of to state it this way. And they were the rule of faith, a general acceptance amongst the body of believers, and apostolic authorship. So to put that in simple terms, it really comes down to, for him, a book could be considered a part of the canon if it was, number one, orthodox in doctrine, number two, widely accepted amongst churches, and third, coming from one of the 12 apostles. Sounds good overall, but those three qualifications aren't necessarily as cut and dry as you would think. To him, this rule of faith, this orthodox doctrine, was significantly more simplistic than how we might define it today. Based on his own writings, it basically just meant you had to believe in the virgin birth, the suffering of Jesus, the resurrection of Jesus, the ascension of Jesus, a creator Father God, an incarnate Jesus Son of God, a Holy Spirit, the authority of Jesus over creation, and eternal punishment for fallen angels and evil people, and eternal grace for those who are, quote, righteous and holy, and those who have kept his commandments and have persevered in his love. So note that even in there, it's not like a salvation by grace that's listed out. A lot of the stuff that we would get into about biblical authority, inerrancy, preservation of scripture, baptism, communion, like a lot of the stuff we look to for orthodox doctrine is not what he laid out as a necessity for a text to be considered orthodox. That's interesting. And then we kind of have to question general acceptance among churches as well. Like, where do you draw the line? Is that a 51% majority agrees with this? And which churches have you polled? Are you just talking to the biggest ones? The heads in Rome and Jerusalem and Alexandria and Antioch? Are you polling the small churches out in the middle of nowhere that, how do you know that you are accurately representing all of the churches out there? There were probably churches that existed that he wasn't even familiar with. So that can break down a little bit. And then the idea of apostolic authorship, well, just look at the New Testament. Even the most conservative of scholars that think that the books were written by who we traditionally say they were written by would have to admit that we fudge a little bit on apostolic authorship. Because, the apostles would be the 12 disciples minus Judas, and usually Paul is put in his place there because he had the vision of the resurrected Jesus. So, that's the idea of apostleship, is you had to be sent out by Jesus himself. Okay, well, that covers Paul, that covers John, that covers Matthew. Luke was not an apostle. Now, people say, oh, well, he was close to an apostle. He was a traveling companion of Paul, so, he probably got a lot of his information from Paul. Okay, well, what about Mark? Now, tradition has Mark as a companion of Peter, but we don't know that for sure. There is no indication of that in any biblical text. There's a little bit of a connection with Paul, so I guess you could go that way, but we don't really know for sure what his connection would have been. And then all this gets even more complicated when we consider what we talked about last week with pseudepigrapha. It was pretty common at that time for people to write in the name of someone else. It wasn't necessarily a generally accepted practice, but it was common. And a lot of scholars believe that many of the books of our New Testament are pseudepigrapha. That doesn't mean they're bad. That doesn't mean they're not authoritative. It just means that maybe Paul didn't write every single book that we have attributed to Paul. Or even outside the claims of the book itself. Like, none of the Gospels actually claim to have been written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. Even Revelation, it says it was written by a John, but there's no indication that it was John, the brother of James, the son of Zebedee that we know from the Gospels. John the Revelator seems to be different from John, the beloved disciple. So, using this rule of apostolic authorship or someone close to an apostle to determine whether or not a text belongs in the New Testament canon, that's a little touchy too. And it's worth noting that while Irenaeus had many important contributions to the early church and to facilitating the establishment of the canon as we know it today, we also have to acknowledge that he was very biased against the Gnostics of his day. The Gnostics were a loose grouping of various Jewish and Christian sects that emphasized gnosis, the Greek word for knowledge. They believed that they had this more complete knowledge of texts and of God's will than what other groups had. Sounds kind of like fundamentalism. And often they would have secretive texts that it was just for their own communities. They tended to be very dualistic. They were often very ascetic. They emphasized a lot of spiritual interpretations of texts and reimagining of texts instead of just the literal physical meaning that would be right there. They emphasized the spiritual over the physical. And so they were very prominent in the first couple centuries of the early church and were fought heavily against by the proto-Orthodox, the early Orthodox Christian leaders. And so a good bit of Irenaeus' ministry was fighting against his enemies in these Gnostic groups. So I think it's just worth keeping in the back of our heads whenever we're talking about Irenaeus that he's probably being colored by his hatred of Gnostics. And what he is saying might be just an overreaction to what he deemed as their heresies. And I mean, we would not even agree with Irenaeus' logic on a lot of things. Like, just talking about the four Gospels, right? Irenaeus said that there could only be the four Gospels that we have today because, and I quote, "It is not possible that the Gospels can be either more or fewer in number than they are. For since there are four zones of the world in which we live, and four principal winds, while the church is scattered throughout all the world, and the pillar and ground of the church is the gospel and the spirit of life, it is fitting that she should have four pillars, breathing out immortality on every side, and vivifying men afresh. As also David says when entreating his manifestation, Thou shalt sit between the cherubim, shine forth. For the cherubim, too, were four-faced, and their faces were images of the dispensation of the Son of God. For as the Scripture says, the first living creature was like a lion, symbolizing his effectual working, his leadership and royal power. The second living creature like a calf, signifying his sacrificial and sacerdotal order. But the third had, as it were, the face of a man, an evident description of his advent as a human being. The fourth was like a flying eagle, pointing out the gift of the Spirit hovering with his wings over the church." End quote. Now, if you're going, "Colin, I did not follow any of that," don't worry. It was quite the read. Basically, Irenaeus is saying there can only be these four Gospels. It has to be four. You know why? Because there are four winds. The wind can come from the north, south, east, or west. And on top of that, the cherubim in the Old Testament had four faces mentioned. And Revelation talks about four beasts. And so therefore, there must be four Gospels. Can you hear the crickets? Yeah, that doesn't really work. This is an example of the logic that he used to determine which book should be in the Bible or not. And this is the guy who popularized this threefold rule that is taught even in some classrooms today. I remember being in Bible college and being taught this is how the canon was determined because everyone agreed on apostolic authorship, on wide acceptance among the churches, and orthodox doctrine. That came from Irenaeus, and this is his idea of determining what belongs in the Bible or not. Irenaeus was honestly kind of a fundamentalist because he was supposedly trained by Polycarp, who tradition says was trained by the Apostle John, or more likely John the Revelator. We don't know exactly how true that is, but you can imagine how Irenaeus might get a little bit puffed up in thinking, well, I have the right true doctrine because I'm just a couple steps removed from the apostles. Like, I get this in an unbroken line from John himself, who got this from Jesus. That's still whisper down the lane. And if your standard for having the right doctrine comes from making sure you're tied to the disciples, I would just say, have you ever read the Gospels? Because the disciples got a good bit wrong in those texts too. So I wouldn't exactly hold that as my standard of making sure I got everything right. But through all of this discussion, it's important to remember that agreements on church canon do not mean that any books not included should be burned or have no use. It really just means that the loudest men in church history, and yes, I do mean men specifically there, because while there were matriarchs in both ancient Judaism and the early church, they tended to get overshadowed by the powerful men of those days. It was just the culture. So it really just means that the loudest men in church history have determined that certain books were more or less useful for public study than others. It's a relative scale. And granted, there were several books that were removed for doctrinal concerns, but many scrolls with doctrinal concerns were left in. I mean, just look at the number of debates we have over every possible doctrine in the Bible. If the whole idea was about only keeping in the stuff with orthodox doctrine, well, we failed. Because pretty much every heresy, every unorthodox doctrine that has existed throughout church history has been perpetuated by people who were basing their beliefs in the Bible. And just look at, you can have a Calvinist and an Arminian, right? And you have the Calvinist who thinks the Arminian is really wrong about the Bible, about God, about salvation, about predestination, about all of that, possibly even bordering on heresy, and they're basing their beliefs in the Bible. And from the other end, you have the Arminian, not Armenian like the country, but Arminian, somebody coming from the opposite end of the spectrum as Calvinism. Calvinism is going to overemphasize the sovereignty of God. Arminianism is going to overemphasize the free will of humanity. And so they're going to look at the Calvinists and say, what you believe about God and the Bible and how you're interpreting this is really wrong and possibly even bordering on heresy. Well, they're coming at it from the Bible too. You can go to passages in the Bible and people have defended soul sleep out of those. People have defended slavery from the biblical text, while other people have fought against slavery from the biblical text. Some people have defended misogyny and patriarchy from the biblical text. Others have emphasized egalitarian views from the biblical text. Some have used the biblical text to condemn homosexuality. Others have used it to embrace homosexuals into the church community. Americans today look at the Bible and end up Republican based on their reading of Scripture, while others look at the Bible and end up Democrat based on their reading of Scripture, while others end up in between. If the whole idea was about making sure that only the right books with the right doctrine ended up in there, we failed. Because almost every debate in church history has revolved around different interpretations of stuff that is in our canon of Scripture. And sure, there are some books that didn't end up in the Bible because they had questionable doctrine, but a lot of books ended up in that have questionable doctrine as well, depending on how you interpret it. It all comes down to how you're going to interpret what is there. All right, I realize all of that talking about Irenaeus can get pretty heady, so let's take another quick break here, regroup in a minute as we round out this discussion and determine how we landed on the New Testament canon that we have today. All right, where we left off was roughly just before 200 CE. Well, less than 50 years after that, this guy named Origen, early church father, created the Hexapla, which was a parallel version of the Old Testament with 6 versions side by side. So if you've ever seen a parallel Bible today, maybe it has like the King James, the ESV, and the NIV or something like that. This was the same idea, and quite revolutionary for its time. It included these 6 versions side by side. Hebrew, the Hebrew transliterated into Greek, not translated, but just transposed into Greek letters. The Septuagint, a translation of the Hebrew into Greek by Theodotion, a translation of the Hebrew into Greek by Aquila, and a translation of the Hebrew into Greek by Symmachus. Now, this Hexapla, you get 6 hex in there, that's where the name comes from, is also significant because Origen marked in the margins where the Septuagint differed from the Hebrew text or other Greek translations. So we have some of our earliest margin notes going on here too. He is also one of our earliest Christian voices on canon, and he accepted the majority of the New Testament canon that we have today, but he did question whether or not the book of James belonged in. He eventually accepted it while speculating that 2nd and 3rd John and 2nd Peter were likely forgeries. And depending on who you talk to, he possibly also included the Epistle of Barnabas, the Shepherd of Hermas, and 1st Clement in his canon. The next big name we have to talk about in this discussion is Eusebius. He was a bishop living in the early 300s CE, And as the story goes, by this point, Constantine, who was emperor of the Roman Empire and the first Christian emperor, wanted Eusebius to produce 50 copies of the Christian texts into Greek. So this would have also included the Old Testament, the Hebrew text, but translated into Greek. Now, we don't know exactly how accurate this tradition is or how many of these 50 requested copies may have been made, but it does seem that Eusebius worked to translate the Hebrew scriptures and important early church documents into a Greek codex that could be delivered to Constantine for him to then spread to major churches in the Roman Empire. Now, Eusebius's own writings are the only record we have of this project, so again, it's kind of questionable whether or not this even happened in the first place, but there are some scholars who think that our oldest codices of the New Testament, Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, may have actually been a part of this project. Now, that is very speculative, and there are plenty of scholars who push back against that as well. But we do at least know that both Sinaiticus and Vaticanus were written around this time, and they have mostly the books that we have today. There is some additions for the Apocrypha, and there's also some missing work, but we don't know exactly how much of that was purposefully left out and just how much has been lost to time. For example, Vaticanus does not have 1st through 4th Maccabees or the Prayer of Manasseh, but it also lacks 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, Philemon, and Revelation. Sinaiticus is missing a good bit of the Old Testament, but it also includes the epistles of Barnabas and the Shepherd of Hermas. Now, regardless of how much of the story is true, or whether or not Sinaiticus and Vaticanus were actually a part of the project if it existed, Eusebius was very important in facilitating the establishment of the New Testament canon as we know it today. He laid out several popular works into main categories, one of which was acknowledged, which basically means everyone that he knew of accepted these books as important for the church as what we would say is canonical. That would be our 4 Gospels, Acts, Paul's letters, including Hebrews. Now, that's a whole other question whether or not Paul wrote that, but Hebrews was included. 1 Peter, 1 John, and Revelation. Now, you may notice there are some books we have in the New Testament that were not included in his list. And this is where he gets into what he would have called disputed works, where maybe they're canonical, maybe not. Different Christians disagree on whether or not these books should be considered canonical. Remember, we're talking just roughly 300 years after Jesus. This debate is still going on. And those books he considered to be James, Jude, 2 Peter, and 2nd and 3rd John. And then he had another category of works that he called spurious, possibly forged. Basically, he doesn't think that they should be canonical. That would be works like the Acts of Paul, the Shepherd of Hermas, the Apocalypse of Peter, the Epistle of Barnabas, the Didache, and the Gospel to the Hebrews. He also mentions a canon for the Tanakh that had been laid out by Melito, a bishop of Sardis, about 140 years after Jesus. So, almost 200 years before his time, that corresponded to our Old Testament, but it included Wisdom of Solomon and leaves out the book of Esther. So now, pushing 300-ish years after Jesus, there is still debate going on about which books belong in this established canon of the Bible, but even if a book didn't make it into that, it's not the same thing as saying the book was thrown out from the church or considered dangerous or heretical or anything like that. There certainly were some works like that, but there were also many that they still recognized as important, but just did not call a part of the canon, did not consider to be something to be studied together in Christian gatherings. Moving a couple decades further out into 367 CE, Athanasius, who was a bishop of Alexandria, was possibly the first person we have record of to mention the 27 books of the New Testament that we are used to. But he also included Baruch and the letter of Jeremiah in his Old Testament and placed Esther among, quote, 7 books not in the canon, but to be read. And in the next several decades, his canon list was confirmed by many other church leaders. Oh, before I get any further, I actually need to backtrack a couple of decades to 325 CE. I can't believe I almost forgot to bring this up. The Council of Nicaea, specifically the First Council of Nicaea, took place between May and July of 325 CE. Thanks to Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code, there are many people in the world today who tend to think that Emperor Constantine gathered together a bunch of church leaders at the Council of Nicaea and determined both the divinity of Jesus and the canon of the Christian Bible. Neither one of those statements is true. We actually have records of what was talked about at the Council of Nicaea, and establishment of a Christian canon was not one of those things. Now, yes, Constantine did gather together a bunch of very important early church leaders in Nicaea for that council with the goal of standardizing an Orthodox Christian belief for the empire, but that is not the same thing as saying he established this is what Christian doctrine is. These teachings were already in place, and just the finer points debated amongst churches and Christian authors. And so really what Constantine just did is he forced a bunch of people who bickered with each other over minutia, and each one wanting to call the other a heretic. He put them all in the same room and was like, all right, let's find some common ground here. And then used that to establish what was going to be the major doctrine for the Roman Empire-sponsored Christianity moving forward. If you have been in more than one church in your lifetime, you know there is no such thing as one body of Christian doctrine or dogma. There's a lot that we agree on. There's also a heck of a lot more that we disagree on. Basically, all it takes to be Christian is you have to believe there's something special about Jesus. Beyond that, we all disagree on different stuff. So it's not to say that that wiped out all disagreement. Now, it certainly quieted certain voices by allowing others to speak more loudly. It allowed certain views to become more prominent over the years. But this is not the same thing as saying that Constantine created what Christian doctrine was going to be. He basically just took a bunch of Christian thinkers and said, all right, let's get together and try to stop all the infighting so much and come together over some least common denominator, some shared beliefs here. But they did not set once for all deciding, okay, these books need to be in the Christian canon. That's not what they were talking about. And while there were other councils that I'll talk about in the next couple minutes here that did talk about the Christian canon, again, that's not the same thing as saying these councils made up the canon. As we've talked for the last hour plus here, these were debates that were already going on. All these councils did was help to standardize what many people already believed. Now, in so doing, it marginalized people who disagreed, which is a whole other discussion, but it's not like these councils were making up new doctrine. They were just prioritizing certain views over others. So the next big council we have to talk about in this discussion is the Council of Rome in 382. And of course, as with everything else, basically everything about this council and the next several are debated, what exactly was covered, sometimes even the existence of certain ones. But from what we can tell, the Council of Rome in 382 CE, the Synod of Hippo in 393 CE, the Synod of Carthage in 397, the Council of Carthage in 419, all of these agreed upon the canon as we know it today. So again, this is not saying that these councils formed the canon. It's just saying that they standardized what was already there for a lot of Christians. They simply made it official. So by 400-ish CE, we have the Christian canon as we know it today. Well, kind of. As we know it today, if you come from a Catholic background, because the canon that these councils agreed upon was the 73 books of the Old Testament, New Testament, and Apocrypha. And the Apocrypha was not considered a separate set of works at this time. It was 46 Old Testament books and 27 New Testament books. And that basically goes on unquestioned in any major way until the 1500s CE. So we're talking 1100 years of church history accepts 46 Old Testament books, 27 New Testament books. As far as we can tell, it's not really until the 1520s and 30s where we get a couple of German translations of the Bible that the apocryphal books were removed from the Old Testament and placed in their own section in between the Old and New Testaments or at the end. And the main person to blame for this is Martin Luther. The first major translation that we have to do that is Luther's translation of the Bible into German. Now, the Catholic Church responded in 1546 with the Council of Trent that approved the current Catholic canon as we know it today, and that was a response to Luther. However, within 80 years, Pope Clement VIII would also remove the apocryphal books from the Old Testament and move them to a back appendix. And this practice of including the Apocrypha, now granted in its own section, but still being included in the Bible, carried over into English versions as well. The earliest English Bibles we have included these deuterocanonical apocryphal works. Miles Coverdale's Bible in 1535 kept in the Apocrypha after the Old Testament section. The Matthew's Bible in 1537 did the same. The Great Bible in 1539. The Geneva Bible in 1560. The Bishop's Bible in 1568. And yes, even the King James Version in 1611 included the Apocrypha in between the Old and New Testaments. It wasn't until about 200 years later, in the early 1800s, that the Apocrypha was removed from most English Protestant Bibles and would only be found in Catholic Bibles. So there you have it, folks. That is how we got our Bibles today. And now, granted, there's plenty of other stuff that we could have talked about, and there are still some controversies that we didn't get to touch on, smaller segments of Christianity that add or subtract other books. Like even today, you have the LDS Church, the Latter-day Saints, colloquially known as Mormons, that will add the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants, and often the Pearl of Great Price into what they might consider biblical canon, depending on the branch of Mormonism. But just looking overall at church history, throughout the majority of Christianity, the majority of Christians have accepted all the books of the Hebrew Old Testament, plus 7-ish books of the Apocrypha and 29 books in the New Testament. Now, I have included several other resources linked to in the show notes that talk more about some of the books that didn't make it in, both the apocryphal books that, didn't make it into Protestant Bibles, and also some of the works that didn't necessarily make it into the Apocrypha, like the Epistle of Barnabas, Shepherd of Hermas, Acts of Paul, Gospel of Peter, Didache, First Clement, and why those may have been kept out, whether it was for doctrinal reasons or language reasons. And there's even some stuff about books that almost didn't make it in but actually did, like Esther, due to God's not being mentioned in there. In fact, Esther is the only book in the Tanakh missing from the Dead Sea Scrolls among Qumran. Ecclesiastes was almost kept out due to unorthodox doctrine. Song of Solomon due to its explicit sexual nature. Revelation because, it's weird, right? So there's so many other rabbit holes we could go down with this. We don't have time to today, so I just linked to some of that in the show notes. So hopefully if you enjoyed this study and found it interesting, you can continue it with some of those resources provided. Canonization can be a touchy topic, especially for people who came from circles like I did, where we had this very cut and dry idea of how the Bible came to be. And, while I'm not trying to tear down anyone's faith with this series, certainly not, hopefully you're able to see some of the complexity and nuance here and how it's not really cut and dry. There was a lot of disagreement, and some people got really ticked off by what didn't get included or by what did. And, we tend to think that the canon is established as what it is today. But in reality, I would argue that the biblical canon is still being determined today by what books that we do and don't reference as a church. Because really, when it comes down to it, like we've talked about, just because a book didn't end up in the Bible didn't mean it was bad. Canon really just means this is something we agree on as useful to study together in church. Well, there are plenty of passages in the Bible that most pastors never touch because it's too weird or the doctrine goes against what they think it should be. Like, how many sermons have you ever heard on Song of Solomon or Ecclesiastes or Lamentations? Right? Like, in a sense, we are creating our own canons in our own churches subtly by the pastors. Now, they don't actually say this from the pulpit, but they do by their actions, telling the church members which parts of the Bible have more value than others, which ones they think are more authoritative than others, which ones they focus on most, by which ones they spend the most time on and reference the most in other sermons. So I hope ultimately that while this probably raised more questions for you than answers, it also gives you a sense of freedom to be able to read outside of the Bible that you knew, whether that's the 66 books of the Protestant canon, 73 of Catholic, or more than that. I would encourage you this week, go online, try to find a copy of some other texts from around that time period, whether it's the Bart Ehrman book I referenced earlier in the episode or something else you can find. Go out and read it It doesn't mean that you have to consider those books to be on the exact same level as the rest of the books you're used to seeing in the Bible, but I think we can all really benefit from reading more of these works from around the time of Jesus, as they help us to understand more about him and his culture and his teachings and what maybe even he and the disciples would have been familiar with in that time. As always, if you have any questions on this, thoughts, comments, complaints you can send somewhere else. Send them to the Bible for Normal People or something. Pete loves that sort of thing. If you've ever seen their social media, they do some great stuff with people who send negative reviews. But seriously, if you have feedback, we'd love to hear from you. You can email us, cconn@thebibleuncut.com. You can write in on our website homepage, come on our socials. We also have, I'll announce this right now, I don't know that by the time I say this it'll be up on socials yet, but maybe it will, maybe it won't. Either way, you'll be some of the first to know. We have started up a Discord chat as well, so we're going to be posting a link where you can hop on a private Discord chat and ask questions about the episodes, discuss politely and respectfully, of course, but we're just trying to keep the conversation going beyond the episode, so we love to hear from you. Next week, we are going to be wrapping out this mini-series, and we're going to be talking about translation and getting the texts from the Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek of the time of Jesus into our modern English that we have today. We're going to be talking about King James Onlyism, major English Bibles, and so much more. It is going to be jam-packed with a lot of fascinating information. I cannot wait for that episode. So until then, stay curious and keep asking questions about the Uncut and Unfiltered Bible. You've been listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We hope we provided a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. If you enjoyed the podcast, would you take a minute to share it with a friend? You could also rate and review on your podcast app. If you'd like to donate to keep our work going, you can go to our website, thebibleuncut.com, and click on the Support Us tab. While you're there, check out the recommended resources and blog where we post show notes and other articles. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.